There have been times when you've had a women's movement this strong, and there's been times when you've had a civil rights movement this strong, and there's been a time when you've had a workers' movement this strong. But it's hard to remember a time when they've all been happening at once. So where does the arms control community fit in?
That's the voice of Joe Cirincione. Cirincione. I swear I could never get that right. Okay, sorry, Derek. Hold on. Keep the music going. Okay, I got it. That's the voice of Joe, who started this podcast 100 episodes ago. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. Tom, we are marking a special milestone on the podcast today. Can you believe this is our 100th weekly episode?
Hey, Michelle. And no, I can't believe it. Since our first episode in April 2019, we have sat down with hundreds of experts in the field, and I want to thank all of those guests for contributing your insights. Our guests make this show happen.
I couldn't agree more. So how are we going to celebrate, you ask? Well, to start, March 8th is International Women's Day. So on Early Warning, we discuss where the Biden administration is at on supporting women's leadership and discuss the prospects of a feminist foreign policy.
And after that, the president of Ploughshares Fund, Emma Belcher, sits down with her predecessor, Joe Cirincione. Joe is now a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in Washington. They will talk about the history of the podcast, reflect on how nuclear policy and advocacy is changing, and they'll tell us about their favorite episodes, why they started the podcast, and what's planned for the future. So please tune in.
Finally, Tom answers a question about the possibility of delivering nuclear warheads on drones on this week's Q&A. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. With that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Alex Stark, Senior Researcher at New America, and Aria Grabowski, Policy and Advocacy Manager at the International Center for Research on Women. Thank you both for joining this week of International Women's Day.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
So as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear and national security news starting now. March 8th marks International Women's Day. UN Women announced a theme of women in leadership achieving an equal future in a COVID-19 world, calling attention to both barriers to women in leadership and the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic on women. Alex, on the first count, what are we seeing here in the United States when it comes to the Biden administration's efforts to advance women's leadership?
Yeah, so President Biden is signing an executive order today on International Women's Day to establish a gender policy council within the White House. So the council will report directly to the president and will have high-level representation across government in agencies from the Council on Economic Advisors to the Department of Defense. And that's an important signal that the administration is taking this seriously and that gender won't just be relegated to kind of the traditional quote unquote women's issues, but that the administration intends to really mainstream a gender lens across all policy areas from the economy to national security. The pandemic stimulus bill or the American Rescue Plan is also an important step forward. Michelle, as you pointed out, the pandemic and economic crisis are having disproportionate impacts on women, especially when it comes to care and work. And so in addition to the stimulus checks that many of us have heard about, the bill includes several pieces that will directly affect women and caregivers, like a child tax credit, expanded child care assistance, family paid sick leave, and things like that.
Where do you hope to see additional steps? Obviously, it's still early, but, there's a lot of conversation going on these days, whether it's about, what we've been discussing, the impact on the economic life or caregiving life that women have, or how we create a more intersectional movement. And so curious to hear what you're looking forward to seeing or hoping the Biden administration will consider.
So these measures are important first steps. But what I'll be looking for is whether this goes beyond just creating a council or getting more women appointed to leadership roles in the administration, even though both of those are important outcomes, but also moving towards a place where every policy decision, whether that's in the domestic policy or national security realm, includes the voices and the perspectives of those who are actually most affected by those policies. And that means, among other things, including a gender lens in every policy decision. So Jennifer Klein, who's the chair of the new Gender Policy Council established today, has said that it's not just a council, but also a plan to actually take a government-wide approach to gender equity, which I think is a really good signal. Ultimately, there are really important connections here between foreign policy and domestic policy. And if the United States wants to be a global leader on these issues, then we need to not just talk the talk internationally, but also to lead the way by implementing these kinds of policies at home.
I'm so glad you're drawing the foreign policy into this because, Aria, that was going to be my next question for you. A related part of this conversation is about whether countries should consider adopting a feminist foreign policy, which we have seen a growing number of countries act on over the past few years, including Sweden, Canada, and Mexico. What is a feminist foreign policy, and how does it differ from what you see in countries now that do not have one?
So I think Alex started to kind of hit on some of those pieces, and it's about using all of the tools in the foreign policy toolbox to dismantle discrimination and prioritize people, peace, and planet while making foreign policy work for women. And so what some of that means when we talk about all the foreign policy levers, it's defense, diplomacy, foreign assistance, trade, and immigration. It's not one or the other. It's not a slice of it. It's all of it. And it also needs to really make sure it's seeking to disrupt colonial, racist, and patriarchal and male-dominated power structures so that kind of we can move forward to make sure that everyone is included in their rights, their representation, and that it's also critical that there's this resources and research piece that I think, Alex was alluding to on that. And in terms of how that sort of differs from what countries are doing now that haven't adopted a feminist foreign policy, I think before I sort of get into that, it's important to remind people that women make up half the world and there's no issue that doesn't affect them or impact them. And so by not kind of including them throughout everything, governments and other actors are basically undermining the rights and the abilities of half the world, which for women and otherwise excluded or further underserved populations, like people who are ethnic or racial minorities, that's even worse. If the needs, challenges, perspectives, and insights of half the world aren't included, it also undermines the economic growth, security, development, and so many other gains that could happen by including them. And I think when we're looking at sort of what is happening in countries that don't have a feminist foreign policy, they're looking at kind of gender equality and women's issues as small slices of something, as a piece to be added, a part of a project, but it's not something that's done continually and throughout. Maybe it's women that are targeted projects but not kind of how is this playing into our economic policy? How is this playing into our defense policy, our diplomacy, our foreign assistance? And I think the best kind of data example we have around what that looks like is in aid where there is reporting on this issue. And according to self-reporting from set of countries to the OECD, about 40% of them have aid that integrates gender. And so that's not just saying that, hey, women sometimes are counted or they're maybe recipients of aid, but that the projects and programs are designed thinking through them, their needs, their insights, their challenges, and their perspectives. And the US sits at about 20%. Whereas a country like Sweden, who has a feminist foreign policy, it's about 90% of their foreign assistance. And so that's a pretty big difference between sort of average, the US without a feminist foreign policy, and then sort of what a feminist foreign policy could look like.
So what are the prospects for adopting such an approach here in the United States?
So I think we're seeing some really positive progress. Congresswomen Representatives Spear, Frankel, Lee, and Lawrence are leading on reintroducing a feminist foreign policy resolution that's set to be reintroduced today. And that sort of lays out the framework for some of this and shows support by Congress for some of these principles. So it says that this isn't just an administration thing, but also something that Congress can play a role in and is setting the stage. They introduced it last fall as well. So this is, something that is not new from the congressional side, but something that they're working to promote. And hopefully we'll continue to get more support and more co-sponsors this time around. And then in terms of what the administration is doing, I think, as Alex mentioned, this White House Gender Policy Council, it's a positive step there. It does talk about the kind of different levers in diplomacy, development, trade, and defense. And so I think there is a real positive step that there maybe will be a more holistic approach moving forward as this kind of continues to unravel. I don't know if that's really the right way to describe it, but and I think it also hits on some key pieces with consultations with civil society, which is critically important for making sure something's feminist and inclusive. And also some accountability measures that are brought in there. I think what will remain to be seen of how much the U.S. will continue to move forward on this is how much the staffing really is bought in, both in terms of who is leading. Yes, we're seeing great diversity and more gender parity among staff, but is there a holistic buy-in for these kind of ideas of gender equality and diversity, equity, and inclusion? Is that part of the culture of all of the leadership and staff? And also what happens in the president's budget request, I think will give a better sense of how serious this is. Is this a White House Policy Council that has a mandate and some effort to move this work forward, but not really full budget throughout all of the different agencies to adequately address it? Or is it something that really we're putting our money where our mouth is on this?
And with that, our time is up. But before we go, where can listeners go to learn more? Aria, I know that you are a part of the Coalition for a Feminist Foreign Policy here in the United States. Full disclosure, I'm a proud steering committee member. But where can our listeners go to read more?
I would just Google ICRW and feminist foreign policy, and that's where the coalition's landing page is. It has a paper on this. It also has a transition memo that was drafted by the coalition and some other documents as well. And then also Google feminist foreign policy resolution. You can check out the House's, what will hopefully be a newly introduced resolution.
Aria, Alex, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Warner, and I'm the managing director of Ploughshares Fund. Even though I've been working in the nuclear field for nearly 9 years, there is still so much to learn. That's why I'm a dedicated listener of Press the Button. I so appreciate each episode where I can get the top stories of the week and a deeper dive into critical conversations with thought leaders and experts in nuclear policy and national security. I'm also a proud supporter of Ploughshares Fund. Did you know that many of the guests featured on Press the Button are supported by Plowshares? Since our founding 40 years ago, all of our work is made possible by individuals just like you. Curious, committed, passionate. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Ploughshares Fund, please donate today. Whether it's $5, $50, $500, your generosity helps create a safer future free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Visit plowshares.org today to make a donation. Or join me and make it monthly. Whatever you do, stay informed, stay safe, and stay connected. Together, we can create a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to a very special episode of Press the Button. This week marks our 100th show. That means for the last 100 straight Tuesdays, rain or shine, we've been coming to you with the best nuclear news and analysis that our field can offer. And to help mark this occasion, I'm joined today by a guest who needs no introduction on this podcast, the former president of Ploughshares Fund and current distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, Jo Cirincione. Jo, thank you so much for coming on. It's a pleasure to have you here and back again.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Terrific. Now we're going to dive into some of the bigger issues in the field today. But since this is an anniversary episode and you were the one who started Press the Button in the first place, I thought I'd ask you, why did you do it? What's so appealing about a podcast? Walk us through your thinking here.
Well, for one thing, when we started it, 100 weeks ago, that's a long time. The podcast was still relatively new, and there weren't 2 million of them, as apparently there are now. And there weren't that many in our field. And partially we saw the good work of Lacey Healy, who had started a podcast called Things That Go Boom, very professional product that was going on, and a few others. Nukes of Hazard had started up a podcast. But we wanted to have this kind of policy discussion that goes on that you can get, because we have all these people coming through the Plowshares office. When we had an office that was opening and there wasn't COVID and people would actually come through your office, we had all these people coming through, and we said, well, let's just put the mic on and sit them down and talk to them so that the rest of the world can hear the kinds of conversations we're having, and we can promote the field. We can show you not just the really, really famous people, what does Ben Rhodes think about the best way forward on nuclear policy, but we can show you the people who are doing the work, the organizers out there, the people in underrepresented communities. What do they think about this? The latest authors, the latest experts that are coming up in the field, the new challenges for the field. So that's what we tried to do. And I got to say, I think we did a lot of that. I'm very proud of Press the Button and the way we've done it. And Emma, you're doing a wonderful job carrying it forward. I can't wait to see what you do with it, how you adapt it, how you morph it into a vehicle for your voice and for a vehicle for the new iteration of Ploughshares Fund.
Well, thanks, Joe. And I do have some ideas about that and some of the people that we can bring in and talk about nuclear weapons in ways that people might not have imagined before. We will be bringing in some people who really have some slightly different takes. So encourage everyone to stay tuned. And Joe, as you look back over the episodes you had a hand in, do any stand out as being particularly fun or enlightening?
I think one of my favorites was with Dante Stallworth, a former NFL wide receiver, and just bringing him on and his perspective. And he's so smart and so informed, and it was just fun to have that. Some of the more interesting ones, I think, were the ones where I talked to former administration officials about lessons learned. If you could do it over again, how would you do nuclear policy in the next administration? We're trying to set up, a new frame for how, if a Democrat was elected president, how they should approach this. In fact, I want to go back over those episodes and listen to them and turn them into an article, what they said. What did Ned Price say? What did Ben Rhodes have to say about this? How about Ivo Daalder? The people who were Lynn Rustin, Wendy Sherman, the people that had the helm at that point, looking back, thinking, well, we should have done things a little differently. Let's remind them what they said and see if they're doing it now.
One for me that was really interesting was when we brought on Miran Cerf and Letha Filderman. Miran is a neuroscientist, and he is looking at decision-making and how looking at the brain and what kind of capacity human beings have for making decisions. And it was just really fascinating. And also he said something quite controversial. And this is what I quite enjoyed was that he said something that I think a lot of nuclear policy experts would have really recoiled at. And I would have loved to have seen the reactions by people when they heard what he had to say on the podcast, which was his thought that perhaps because of human beings' lack of capacity to make these type of decisions, that decision to launch nuclear weapons should be not made by human beings, but instead by machines.
Oh, great. Machines.
Right.
This guy's never seen Terminator?
Well, it was interesting because, that was, my sort of initial reaction was, I was kind of mortified. And, we had a bit of a discussion with the Plowshares staff about that too, and concerns about, vulnerability of systems to being hacked, as well as, algorithms that go into decision-making, and whether you could really, truly rely on machines in that sense. But I think that potentially sparks an interesting conversation, and to me just highlighted how ridiculous is that we have these weapons in the first place, how much damage they could potentially do, and really kind of underscores the reason for taking away these dangers. So I just thought that was really interesting, and I loved that he said that, because that's what then sparked the conversation.
That's great.
So for me, that's sometimes what's the most fun about these kind of discussions, is that you get sometimes some of these ideas that really push and make people rethink and challenge assumptions.
Yes.
So now moving on from the podcast, looking at policy and looking at what the nuclear field has done really well, and where some of its challenges lie, what would you say, in reflecting on your time at Plowshares, what have been the sort of big wins, and what have been some of the challenges?
Well, I've been in the nuclear field for almost 40 years now in Washington. I came as a grad student in 1981, and I've been studying nuclear policy and then working in the Reagan administration, actually, then up at the House Armed Services Committee, then in the think tank world. And so I've seen a lot go on in this field. And several things strike me about the accomplishments. One is how the arms control and disarmament communities have, become a permanent part of the debate in Washington. I mean, it was John F. Kennedy that started the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. He wanted to enshrine this as a function of the government. If we have a Department of Defense, then we should have a Department of Peace. And this was his way to do that. But of course, institutional Washington doesn't really think that way. There's not a lot of money in arms control and disarmament. You don't really advance your career by taking this on as an issue. So what's happened is the NGOs have been able to establish these parallel structures that have lasted now for decades, and some of the greatest successes have been in championing the arms control regimes that began really under Nixon, but then Reagan accelerated, and the arms control community has been there to provide the expert analysis, to offer ideas, and to be the advocates for pushing it. Expert reports are nice, but you really need political pressure to get these in. And I've been surprised over the years about how effective relatively small groups of passionate people can be in creating the political space that allow these officials to do the things they want to do, but are getting pushback for. But recently, I think the thing I've been most impressed with the arms control and disarmament communities is not their political achievements, but their demographic ones. I feel like they've made the change. They have made the switch. They have moved on to a younger generation. I mean, one of the reasons I stepped down as president of Plowshares was that I found myself being the oldest person in the room. I would go to these meetings, and these people were a generation or more younger than me. And I would tell stories about the 80s, and they would, glaze over. Another 80s stories. And I realized they didn't need me anymore. I mean, you've seen these people in their 20s, especially, and their early 30s, really taking the reins of these organizations and adding that perspective, adding that energy, and also on gender and on race, on gender more. And we've made it a priority at Ploughshares Fund, and you're continuing that. You're seeing the increased diversity in the field. I mean, this used to be a field of old white men. I mean, that was it forever when I was here, and it just ain't that way anymore. That is a remarkable change, although, of course, we still have a long way to go. The challenge, I think, is that while you might think of the peace movement or the arms control movement as being one of the major currents in national security policy, I'm not sure that's true anymore. In part, not because they've been pushed aside by the right wing, but because all these other mass movements have sprouted up over the last few years. I mean, there have been times when you've had a women's movement this strong, and there's been times when you've had a civil rights movement this strong, and there's been a time when you've had a workers' movement this strong. But it's hard to remember a time when they've all been happening at once. So where does the arms control community fit in? Where does this national security sentiment fit in? Theoretically, it could fit in with what Biden administration wants to do, which is reimagine national security. That's what they say they want to do. And you can see they're bringing climate change as a national security threat, racial justice as something that must be addressed by the Department of Defense, right? And you can see the increased concern about the rise or the new rise of white supremacy that's plagued this country for centuries. So where in that matrix does arms control take place? What's the role of nuclear weapons, nuclear budget? How does this impact our choices? There's discussions about that. There's movements about that, but there isn't a solution for that yet. That's the big challenge for this community, as far as I can see.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I mean, I think on your reflection about the changing nature of the community, I absolutely agree, and I'm really excited about it. And I think you've mentioned the increasing diversity and the support that the diversity is getting from higher levels and more established levels of organizations and people in the field, which is terrific. And I think that will bring us the answer to your question of how arms control and nuclear weapons fit in to these mass movements that we're seeing right now. And I see all of these movements on these different ideas: racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, and climate justice. And really what we're talking about is one mass movement toward peace, security, and justice. Rather than thinking about separate movements, it's more about what's our common thread here. It's that we are all wanting a world that is safer, more secure, more just, and more peaceful. And when you look at the relationship of all of these issues, some of it comes down to prioritization. You know, what truly keeps us safe and what matters to us. And this is where we're talking about, you know, redefining national security. And I'm thrilled that the Biden administration is wanting to take that on. And we see a sort of a real effort to look at these issues sort of through that lens, to the extent that we can then see more than lip service to this. But how does this really shake out in practice? I think that's where we're going. And when I talk about prioritization, I'm looking at where's the money being spent? What gets the attention and the funding that it deserves? We look at nuclear weapons and how much is spent on nuclear weapons. It's been quite interesting, Joe, is speaking with people in other movements. We've been speaking with people in the racial justice area, we've been speaking with people in climate, been speaking with people in the health area with respect to the current pandemic that we find ourselves in. So we've been asking this basic question. The modernisation program for ICBM is projected to be $260 billion. Let's take that amount of money. Let's say we don't need that because not only is it wasteful, but it also makes us less safe. Take that amount of money. We've been asking in different fields, what would you do with that amount of money? And what's been kind of amazing to me is to see how when you talk to an epidemiologist, they think of something that could be change things on a dramatic scale for several billion dollars. And then they're like, oh, well, what do I do with the rest of the money that would take us up to $260 billion? And for me, that sort of highlights the ludicrous amount that we're spending on nuclear weapons and what we could do if we didn't spend even a fraction of that on nuclear weapons. And so for me, sometimes I think it's a hard question for people to answer because they just can't conceive of how you would spend $260 billion.
One of the reasons you don't hear Washington talk that much about the cost of nuclear weapons is that the system's already rigged. It's already designed to push these budgets through. I mean, last year, for example, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee, the House Armed Services Committee, had exactly three hearings, and didn't call any outside witnesses. It was all government witnesses. They just rubber stamped Trump's last nuclear budget. And the reason is all the members of the committee benefit from these contracts, and they have states. Or if you looked at the hearings for Wendy Sherman or Colin Kahl, and how Colin Kahl in particular was being hammered to try to get him to genuflect to the new ICBM. That's all they care about. And when he said, well, I haven't looked at the data recently, I have to look at the cost and the intelligence. And Tom Cotton didn't want to hear that. He just wanted him to commit to the new ICBM without making a study of whether we needed this. So you can see how the political forces are aligned against us. And what does that mean for the Biden administration? I think these guys this is the best national security team we've had in a very long time. These people are dedicated and committed and stuff, but they got a lot of stuff to do. And so I'm afraid that they're going to revert to the sort of classic Democratic pose, which is to try to shore up their right flank so that they can accomplish a lot on their left flank, the domestic policy. And Lord knows they have enough to do there. Pandemic, economic recovery, fighting racial injustice. They have a lot of things they want to do. They don't even have their team in place yet. So they don't want to ruffle too many feathers, etc. So our job out here is to say, no, we're not going to wait. We're not going to wait. And it's our job to make alliance with those NGOs who care the most about the domestic agenda, who want all that money for climate change, who want it for healthcare, who want it for good schools, and help convince them you can't get that unless we cut that $2 trillion nuclear modernization budget. You can't get your domestic programs enacted if we go to war with Iran. There's trade-offs here. And so these domestic groups that have very large constituencies, that have millions of people involved in them, have to understand that this has got to be part of their agenda too. Not the lead element, but a part of their portfolio. Their cause is our cause is their cause.
Shifting gears again, you were involved very heavily in the Iran nuclear deal back in 2015. Tell us, what are your thoughts on that time, but also where we are now?
This is an excellent example of how something that has broad expert consensus, we should use diplomacy to stop Iran from developing the capabilities for a nuclear weapon. We should not fight another war in the Middle East, becomes so difficult to implement when you go up against the entrenched interests in Washington. I mean, there was never a significant expert disagreement with the structure of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran deal. It had overwhelming support from diplomats and military officials, including Israeli military officials and Israeli intelligence officials. We just had a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post from the former deputy chief of staff of the IDF, General Golan, saying that when the JCPOA was enacted, the general staff breathed a sigh of relief. And the more they studied this, the more they understood what a well-constructed deal this was. That's because it was. But there's a big difference between winning the expert debate and winning the experts over and winning over the political class in Washington and getting your expert analysis put into policy. And there we ran right into the Saudi, Israeli, neoconservative, conservative machine, which is very strong in this town. There's a reason the Saudis have funded think tanks so heavily. There's a reason defense contractors have given so many grants to think tanks in the last 20 years. There's a reason that AIPAC focused on this, right? And that was, they were serving the interests of Israelis and Saudis and defense contractors, and not what was in the best interest of the American people, or for that matter, the Iranian people. So you really had to develop a political operation that could create the space that would allow politicians to follow the advice of the experts. I mean, I think of, when I look at the COVID battles, for example, I think of the same thing. The scientists are all in agreement on what to do. The politicians won't let them do it. So you've got to create the political space, and that's where we are today. I know Joe Biden wants to get back into the deal. I know Tony Blinken does, and Jake Sullivan do. But they got a lot of other things they have to do too. And I got to tell you, I think Iran is not in their top 10. And I understand this. Tony Blinken's home alone. He doesn't have any of his senior people nominated, and he has to go through the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And who's the chairman? Robert Menendez. What does he think about the Iran deal? He opposed it. He's much closer to AIPAC than he is to J Street. So you don't want to make the Iran deal an issue with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee before you get your nominees approved. And when you do have a nominee going up there, you want them to be tough on Iran. You can't afford to lose his vote. So I understand that, but we're losing time. The clock is ticking on Iran. And it would have been so much easier if they had just rejoined the JCPOA in the same week that they rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, that they rejoined the World Health Organization, that they did so many other steps undoing the damage Trump did. This is one of the big damages he did, violating the deal. They just got to rip off the Band-Aid and get back into the deal, because that's what's going to give us leverage to get Iran back into compliance to the deal, and then give us the foundation to go on and solve these other issues like the ballistic missile program and their actions in the region. You can see the path, and I can, Emma, you have been funding in the year that you've been there, a number of expert reports that have produced roadmaps for how to get back there. But how do we create the political space so the politicians can follow those roadmaps? You also run into this blob thinking in Washington that leverage that is good. And there's this view, and I think people in the administration still hold this, that the Trump sanctions give us leverage over Iran, that somehow the pressure should be continued, and that by increasing the pressure on Iran, we can somehow have them make concessions. Well, that failed miserably under Trump, and it's failing now in just the first 6 or 7 weeks of the Trump administration. It's not working. It's backfiring. Right. I see a window opening up again. There's a small window opening up where the Iranians seem to be willing to edge back to the table. The Americans seem to be willing to edge back to the table. But there are so many saboteurs in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in the region, in the Department of Defense, in the State Department, who want to kill this deal. It really is going to take some bold action by Biden to just say, okay, let's go, boys, before one of these saboteurs can put a stick in the spokes and prevent the negotiation from happening. And it doesn't take that much because the window's closing. In the middle of April, Nowruz holiday starts. That usually slows down Iranian government functions. And then the elections happening in June, that could freeze any ability of anybody to negotiate with the Americans. So you really got about 6 weeks to get this deal done. I hope we can instill a sense of urgency in the administration to do it.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I think one of the things that you talked about, the maximum pressure and sanctions, we know that sanctions don't typically result in the kind of outcomes that we would want in this respect. We see it time and time again that they typically end up hurting the people rather than the regimes or the governments.
It's amazing in this town how little talk there is about the Iranian people. For all the talk about we have to get rid of this regime, it's oppressing the Iranian people, and how cruel this regime is, which is true. This is a brutal, repressive regime. We'd all be better off, and the Iranian people would be better off if this regime was gone. But nobody talks about the pain that's being inflicted on the Iranian people because of our sanctions, independent of what the regime is doing, like just restricting the supply of medicines to combat COVID.
Absolutely.
It's right. It's awful. And human rights. How are you really going to improve human rights in Iran? Well, that goes through the JCPOA. You want to, right?
Yep. And I just think in this time where we're all recognizing our shared humanity with COVID and the terrible situation that we're in around the world, that this would be something that should be forefront of the administration's mind. And I think actually some relief that really is meaningful here would be a great signal. And I think it's not wouldn't be a signal of weakness. And this is what is really, I think, quite frustrating in that the sense that taking a kind of principled approach, a values-based approach, an approach to diplomacy is seen by many people as a sign of weakness. We've got to flip that around. And I think when we look at the work that we're doing with respect to, just as a society, racial justice issues, we are seeing that violence, militarism, and white supremacy is not a form of strength. It is actually a form of weakness. And so I think the more we start to think about what do we stand for, taking a values-based approach, that's really the way we need to be leading in our foreign policy. And I am quite pleased to see the sort of rethinking of foreign policy and the way that the United States wants to show up with respect to its foreign policy that's been articulated recently by Tony Blinken and the president's vision of foreign policy and America's role in the world. But we've got to really follow that up by action. And I just think the United States left the deal, and I think it's really incumbent on the United States to make a first move. And I think in this humanitarian issue, with relief of sanctions during a time of COVID would be the perfect place to start.
Well, this is exactly what Senator Chris Murphy said last week at the Council on Foreign Relations. He said, why not take the first move? I'm willing to take the first move. Let's make a humanitarian exception to the sanctions to get the medicine. I mean, why are we afraid of doing that? Interestingly, Emma, when President Biden ordered military airstrikes on the Iraqi militia, Kataib Hezbollah, in retaliation for what we believe was their strike on U.S.-related forces February 15th, I thought that was going to be to the benefit of President Biden. I mean, traditionally, Americans like to see us blow things up. They like to see a president take strong action. And the Biden administration is really shaping the persona of President Biden still. It's still early in the administration. Who is this guy? Well, this is a guy who's not afraid to use military force. This is a guy who says, Iran, you cannot act with impunity. But guess what? And I was really surprised by this. It turns out the American people didn't like that strike. He did not get a bump in the polls because of this. You had a lot of regular Americans with no stake in the game saying, what? What are you doing that for? How much did that cost us? And so we may be at this point where some of the assumptions that traditional Washington is making about what the public wants and what looks good for the president is just out of date. It is pre-pandemic. It is pre-economic recession. It is pre-Black Lives Matter. And it's time, and this may be changing. And when things change this fast, it's sometimes hard for us to understand it. So it's important to have podcasts like this where we can sort of analyze it in real time and try out our latest interpretation of events.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we need to go. And this is what we're going to be doing on this podcast. And with respect to what we're doing at Plowshares is challenging assumptions, asking questions, why not? And you're right, these questions are not questions people who benefit from the status quo want to hear. There are people who really have invested interest with respect to dollars and money in nuclear weapons and keeping the status quo. And they don't like it when you ask questions. So that's a big role I see for civil society here, is to be asking questions and to be continuing to push. So thanks so much, Joe, for coming on. We've run out of our time today. We could talk on for hours, I know.
Well, I could talk on for hours. I got nothing to do. No.
Now that you're retired.
This has been great, Emma. Thank you so much for letting me come on and rant a little bit. It's a pleasure. And now I'm a strong Plowshares supporter, no longer a Plowshares president. I'm so pleased with how well the organization is going and how important Plowshares still is in the battle for more just, more humane national security policy for the United States.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Joe. Catch you later.
Bye-bye.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
And now, for my favorite segment of the podcast, the nuclear Q&A. Tom, are you ready for this?
Bring it on, Michelle.
This week's question comes from Taylor in Atlanta. Taylor asks, is there anything keeping nuclear-armed nations from putting nuclear weapons on drones? Is the technology not there, or is there an international norm or treaty that prevents it?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Taylor in Atlanta, for a great question. You know, there isn't anything that prevents nations from putting nuclear weapons on drones other than their common sense, which I'm glad to say so far is holding up. You know, if you think about it, the United States is designing a new bomber, a new strategic bomber. That bomber could be a drone, right? We don't need pilots on bombers anymore. So that could be a drone, and that could be a nuclear-armed drone. So these things could be in our future. For example, some would consider nuclear-armed cruise missiles as drones. They're not piloted once they're launched. And then once they're launched, their positioning can be changed. So you might consider that a nuclear-armed drone. I don't think I would necessarily, but it's right on the line. And so, some of this is happening. Some of this could happen. We could be going in that direction. There's all kind of debate at the United Nations about drone policy and related issues. I would just add that, in my opinion, putting nuclear weapons on drones, and particularly on weapons where there isn't a human in the loop to make the decision, is a tremendously bad idea. And some people have proposed as artificial intelligence gets better, as false alarms or risks to our command and control increase, that we should reduce the involvement of humans in the loop. And to me, that's exactly the opposite way we want to go. We should be looking to get more human involvement we need to increase the time individuals and the human element has in making decisions about nuclear launch, not decrease it. We should be not moving towards making this more of an artificial intelligence operation. We need to increase the time for decision makers. We need to make sure that there's always a human in the loop. The scenario I would point out is, we have an increasing possibility of false alarms due to cyber attacks, to the point now where no president can assume a nuclear attack is real until that attack has landed. And so we should never be giving that responsibility, that ultimate decision-making authority, to a machine that could be spoofed, that could be hacked, that could simply get it wrong. Final word on this: let's hope and let's ensure that there's always a human in the loop when making decisions about nuclear policy, in particular nuclear use, and let's give that decision maker, and hopefully more than one decision maker, as much time as possible to make what could be a civilization-ending decision.
Another week, another question. Thanks, Taylor. And thank you, Tom. And remember, if you want your question answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Sender, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyricsborn and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.